All right. Good afternoon again, folks. We're back for chapter 6. Up to this point, we've been spending a lot of time looking at how the police came to be about, and learning a little bit about the internal workings of the police, the hiring, the recruitment, and the training. We're now moving on to kind of what it feels like to be a police officer, and what are the stressors on policing. So we're talking about stress, right? Stress is a force that is external in nature. It causes both physical and emotional strain upon the body. There are two kinds of stress. There's eustress, which is a word we don't use very often, and then there is distress, which is the negative stress. And that, as many of you know, stress could be negative stress could be caused by many things. All life, relationships, money, family, health, work, physical fitness, stress from having to participate in public meetings, and just general sort of stress related to low self-confidence. There's traumatic stress, which is the stress associated with some very specific event. It is what we normally kind of think about when we talk about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we're also talking about chronic stress, which is the accumulation of stress over time. And it could be lots of little stressors, but over time, those accumulations of little stressors end up becoming fairly substantial, what we call chronic PTSD. Chronic is a word that just means that it exists over time. Lots of other sources of stress: organizational administrative practices, work conditions, relationships with the people that supervise you, the specific assignments that you're given, and your relationship with coworkers. In the police world, sometimes you have some control over your assignment. Oftentimes you don't, and you may be working difficult locations and difficult hours. And I mean hours, I mean shift work. And you don't really have a choice over what people are on your shift and who you work with on the road at the particular time that you're working. The stress of just participating in the criminal justice system, making observations about what works and what doesn't work, and the stuff that doesn't work causes stress. And then possibly the one of the largest sources of stress is just the police organization's relationship with the public. As many of you can know and likely understand, there is an anti-police movement across the country. Whether that anti-police movement is valid or not is a separate issue, but it exists out there, and certainly a source of stress for the police. And then there's the stress intrinsic to the police work itself. It's there's always the possibility that police officers are going to be in a dangerous environment. As I indicated previously, we're talking about shift work, career status, where the officer is currently, and where they would want to go. Do they want to stay doing shift work? Do they want to do detective work, investigations? Is there training that they would like to do that they haven't been able to do? Those sorts of things. And then there's the health issues associated with all of those things. And this is one of the reasons why I have recommended, to the extent that you're comfortable, trying to do a ride along with the police, because many of these stressors, you will see organically how the police officer acts in relation to all these different stressors. And it's very informative, I believe, to go and sort of walk the shoes of the police officer for a short period of time, so that you can kind of see what their world looks like. So the organization itself, the police organization itself, can be a source of stress for the police officers. The departments establish strict rules and regulations, and those rules and regulations don't always fit neatly into the particular fact situations that the police officer is facing on the road. There are specific rules that dictate how the officers perform duties and responsibilities, and it drives performance. It drives the expectations for the police. It affects whether or not the police officer gets promoted. And again, as I indicated, is that sometimes those kinds of rules that are created are not rules that have been tested out on the street. They're rules that feel like intuitively they make sense. But then when they're actually the police officers required to employ it, it becomes more difficult. Years ago, in response to concerns about domestic violence, many law enforcement agencies adopted a mandatory arrest policy for domestic violence. And the idea was that the police officer was supposed to assess who the primary aggressor was. And then that person would be arrested, removed from the situation. The problem with that was that two things. One was that oftentimes by the time the police officer was there, the abuser is sitting in a chair watching TV, and the victim is still agitated and upset and could certainly be perceived as being the primary aggressor at the time that the police officer arrives at the scene. So what was happening was that police officers were arresting the person who was actually the original victim of the domestic violence. The other unintended consequence of the policy was that sometimes police officers would go in a situation, and since they couldn't determine who the primary aggressor was, they would arrest both the alleged suspect and the victim. So there's an example of like stress that officers have to deal with because they have to apply these rules in real world situations, and oftentimes those rules don't fit neatly in the particular set of facts that the officer is faced with. So we're talking about the just working, the kind of stresses related to working there, and then it's compounded if you are a minority or you are a woman. Women police officers face sexism, sexual harassment, stereotyping, and there's a lot of attention paid to female officers that's not paid to male officers, that then, as you can imagine, would increase the stress of the individual female police officer. The criminal justice system itself, as I indicated previously, can create can be a source of stress. There are certainly judges out there who have a sort of natural hostile attitude towards the police. I think most don't, but it's certainly out there. But judges are probably a really good example, probably worth talking about, is that, the police are held to a very high standard. It's almost like brain surgeons, right? So naturally, brain surgeons are going to make a mistake. They're going to make a mistake somewhere over, hundreds of surgeries. But when they make that mistake, we hold them accountable for that mistake, no matter how human they are. And we have a tendency to do the same thing with the police. The public sort of thinks that the police really aren't allowed to make a mistake. And for really good reasons. I mean, especially considering that oftentimes the police officer has the ability to make some decisions about whether or not an individual loses their liberty. So you can certainly appreciate the idea that you would want to hold the police to a fairly high standard. You want them to get it right, at a pretty high clip. Prosecutors often, as a former prosecutor, I can guarantee you this, Prosecutors have a tendency to treat police poorly. When police officers make charging decisions that are not the exact legal decisions of police officers, sometimes because the prosecutors, sometimes because they're under their own set of stresses, can be fairly rude to police officers. So in the same way that you would think about how you would address a police officer that's rude to the public, you've got the same kinds of situations with prosecutors also. And then there's the general stress of police officer who had a stressful encounter with a member of the public. They make a charge, they come to court, and neither the prosecutor nor the judge nor the probation or parole officer seems to take any of it very seriously. And certainly consciously hurts the police officer's feelings, right? So they would police officer could be walking around fairly unhappy with all the participants of the criminal justice system, because the police officer's working hard to do the right thing on the road, and it just kind of feels like no one cares in the courthouse. Courts are probably the greatest source of stress within the criminal justice system. You have the trial court issues, then you have appellate courts who are going to look at the police officer behavior from what we call armchair quarterbacking, where they're going to be able to second guess everything that the police officer did, but subtracting out the high adrenaline, the stress of the particular job, the stress of the particular situation, the relative information that the police officer had at the time that may be different later on when the appellate court evaluates the police officer's behavior. So you could certainly understand how what the courts do contribute to police officer stress. So the public itself, when the police officers go out, respond to a call, and they interact with the public, it's an all separate set of stress all by itself. When resolving situations, the community police make some people happy and make others unhappy. There are some police officers who, because of their type of personality and because of just the way they look at the world, they are better at dealing with people who are unhappy than others. We have a tendency to recruit people who are type A personalities or high functioning, smart, but also competitive. And sometimes police officers get competitive. They get, especially when a member of the public is matching their energy and matching their competitiveness. And sometimes the police officer loses sight of who they're dealing with, right? Certainly police officers walk into situations where people just make the assumption that by definition, if you're a police officer, that you're racist. And that's because there's a lot of really, really appropriate examples of police officers acting in a racist fashion. The problem is, in the same way that we wouldn't want anyone to lump us in with everyone else, they judge us individually. Police officers kind of don't want to be judged generally. They want to be judged specifically. But many times police officers go into situations and people make the assumption that they're racist and that they're going to behave according to being to their particular bias. Police officers need to keep the relationship with citizens in proper perspective, but they often don't. And the reason why is because the police officers stressed out, or the police officers training didn't provide them with the tools to deal with the person who's challenging their authority or who's matching their energy. It shouldn't be a surprise to you that police officers are often not trained to interact in a way that de-escalates the stress of the situation. This is one of the reasons why we do a lot of open discussions. We do round tables, and we do, and at some point we'll probably do as a discussion board with you, about what the public attitudes of the police are and what their people's individual encounters have been with the police and whether those encounters were positive or negative. Um, and then the people who are in a supervisory relationship with on the road police officer, they have to sort of pay attention all the time about improving the police public relations and showing up on scene and evaluating how the police are handling the public so that they can do feedback to help the officer get better at dealing with the public. Sort of more stressors intrinsic to the police work. Police work includes situations posing, as you can imagine, physical danger. It's one of the reasons why I encourage you to do something like a ride along, or if you go into YouTube, there's multiple videos that show really difficult situations that police find themselves in, and like physical confrontations with suspects, traumatic incidents, police officer who's having a fairly calm conversation with someone and then someone pulls a gun out and shoots at the police officer, causes all kinds of psychological problems. Police officers who are trying to avoid getting hurt actually get hurt, and they walk around with physical injury all the time. Car accidents, trying to pursue suspects, chasing folks, stepping in a hole while you're chasing someone, people who resist arrest not just going rigid to prevent the police officer from arresting them, but punching them, biting them, spitting on them. There's just all of those concerns, right? And then similarly, there's another set of police officers who become undercover officers, and they put themselves in the criminal world and the criminal culture, and you have the stress of not being discovered. You have the stress of it's a lifestyle that some police officers find attractive and get lured into and end up doing inappropriate things. That's a stress all by itself. So what's the effects of stress? Right now, 15% of officers are in burnout phase, which means that they are working, but they are not functional. And because they're not functional, they are the ones who account for about 70 or 80% of all complaints against the departments. Those burnout phase kind of officers, the ones who are just so stressed out that they are not functioning in the way that we would want them to function on the job, that creates all kinds of problems: psychosomatic illness, alcoholism, depression. And then their reactions to all of that become odd. Excessive use of sick leave, lots of family marital disorders, just no team attitude, doing the minimum necessary to get through a shift, increased car accidents. It's just, you can see it, you'll know it when you see it. Suicide is very high compared to the regular population among police officers. So as a result of that, police agencies across the United States have gotten a little bit better about trying to come up with programs to help police alleviate all these different stressors. There are employee assistance programs, wellness programs that improve physical fitness, provide mental health counseling that allows the officer to find ways to manage stress, diet assistance, and then chemical alcohol dependency assistance. Most police agencies have some form of EAP. A number of the poorer police organizations do not have it. So it's a problem, right? Excessive drinking, alcoholism are problems, are constant problems in policing. And then because the police kind of feel like that they're in it all together. You have other police officers who will help an officer who's having substance abuse issues. Will help them. Will help cover it up. Or will say to the supervisory officer that they don't think that an officer has a problem when they kind of know that they do. As a result of that, the officer who actually needs help isn't requesting help, and his friends around him are saying that he doesn't need help. And then, of course, police officers are not immune to the ever emerging opioid epidemic. And to the extent that officers are discovered that have a substance abuse issue, they're kind of required or held to a higher standard than regular citizens about obtaining substance abuse treatment, and then really a zero tolerance policy. If they relapse, then they get fired. So moving along, on top of all of that, the police officers are always sort of struggling about the job itself. How does it get paid? What happens when they work overtime? What benefits do they have? Do they have any choice over where they work or when they work or how often they work? Years ago, courts have established that public employees have a property interest in their employment. And as a result of that, the concept of labor relations has come into being. Probably started or most clearly right around World War I, when policing had both increased, but also because of Reconstruction, because of Industrial Revolution. There are all kinds of additional police needs that occurred, and police officers were being required to work excessive hours, excessive numbers of days, and the governments were taking the position that because they are a public safety employee, that they don't have any rights. They have to work, and they have to work when the public tells them to. All that sort of changed over time. Police Officers' Bill of Rights. It came into being as a reaction to these problems. When a police officer is under investigation, it provides those police officers certain kinds of specific rights: written notice as to what they're being investigated about, right to representation, either by a union representative or lawyer, and right to have a polygraph examination. But also the flip side of that, they can't be compelled to complete a polygraph examination if they're being accused of a criminal violation. There are some offices that take the position that if there's an alleged victim in the case and that victim takes the polygraph and passes the polygraph, the police officer then is compelled to take a polygraph examination. And the interesting thing that for you is that, polygraph examinations, or the results of polygraph examinations, are not admissible in the court of law for any purpose, and even with the agreement of lawyers. That being said, if they're used in law enforcement all the time, both for police officer investigations and when the officers are under investigation, but also for investigations of actual crime. Alleged suspects get offered polygraph examinations all the time. There has been an increase in police officers filing grievances when they believe that their rights have been violated. The kinds of grievances that police officers complain about or file grievances about, any kind of job action. They've been moved from one shift to another. They've been told that they're going to do a different kind of work. Pay is an obvious one. When they work, the shift work, the work assignments. whether they were passed over for promotion or whether they were denied a transfer. And then just as the subject of discipline, they did something wrong, they were disciplined, they feel like that they were treated unfairly, and as a result of that, they file a grievance. So a reaction to all of this is that in the early 1900s, around World War One, because police agencies were getting larger, and police officers were being required to work ridiculous amounts of hours and ridiculous numbers of days. Police attempted to unionize. Big jurisdictions like Boston and Massachusetts generally, the governor, when the police tried to unionize, banned the union and made a statement that any police officer who joined the union would be fired. That sort of came to a head on September 9th, 1919, when the Boston police force went on strike. And as a result of that, streets were set on fire by people who knew that the police weren't working. Many people were killed. And as a result of that, unions were allowed to be established on behalf of the police. Those unions have sort of evolved over time. They are the way you would probably hear about them these days is what you hear of the Fraternal Order of Police, the FOPs, or other kinds of police associations. They're sort of the public-facing organizations that are part of the unions. Unionization has continued to flourish since the 1970s. Most officers in the United States are members of unions. And the unions will represent police officers at all the different levels. So collective bargaining is what unions do. So collective bargaining is the idea that all police officers, they sort of agree to allow unions to bargain on their behalf. And in your reading, there's a sample police contract that sets how often people have to work, what their hours are, whether or not they get overtime pay, how much that overtime pay would be, what other benefits they're entitled to, what is the grievance procedures that they're afforded, or what kind of police officer rights that they're afforded, and then the other one is like, what is the criteria for becoming a police officer, whether or not education, a particular kind of education, college education, would be required of police officers. That contract gets created by the union and then gets submitted to the management. Management makes a decision as to whether or not they're going to agree to that contract or not. If they say no, then that contract and the union representatives and the management representatives will then go under really three different models: binding arbitration, meet and confer, which is where they just sit down at a table and see if they can work it out on their own, which doesn't happen all that often. Or in some places, it's bargaining's not required. The union sets what the contract is, and that's just what it is. Most situations, it's binding arbitration. Binding arbitration is a little bit of a fancy word, or phrase. It's the idea that you would both sides would pick individuals, public individuals who they trust, and those people would hear the arguments for and against the particular contract, and then and both sides would also agree that whatever the arbitrator says or decides is binding on both sides. So the arbitrator would hear arguments on both sides regarding the contract, ultimately make a decision as to what is the best contract that accomplishes all the goals of both management and the union. And then once the arbitrator makes that decision, it's binding on both sides. as I indicated, collective bargaining is negotiations between union and management. And we talk about mediation, arbitration. The difference between mediation or arbitration: mediation is sending both sides to go talk to the person that they trust, but it's not binding. Mediator says, "Look, this is the best you can do," and as a result of that, this is what I think both sides need to do. And then one side or the other can say, "No, we're not going to do that." And at that point, they could choose to go to arbitration rather than mediation. And then sometimes the same kind of concept where same kind of folks that would be selected as arbiters could be hired to just do fact finding, to establish what facts exist that support one side or the other. And then a large part of union participation or collective bargaining is dealing with grievances, setting up what the process is, what rights the individual police officers have, that kind of thing. And then if there's not an agreement, unions can strike. They can decide to not work. They can have votes where they basically do a vote of no confidence in the police chief or even the union representative or the person that actually represents the whole union. They can order slowdowns, which would bog the system down. They can order speed ups. A speed up in the police context is where they would inform their members to write an inordinate or a high number of tickets, pull every single possible person that you can pull over. That then creates a public backlash to the police, which would then put pressure on management to meet the demands of the police union. And like as I indicated previously, strikes or work stoppage. Over time, the Fair Labor Standards Act came into being, and it's basically a law that was passed so that it would be it was originally created to apply to private security. It was then passed to apply to public security, and it sets minimum standards for how often you can make someone work, how much they're entitled to be paid, whether they're entitled to have overtime. So the big debate, and it's a big debate within the police unions, is whether or not police agencies should require higher education as a criteria for becoming a police officer. So a couple important facts for you to think about: police generally lag behind the general society in terms of emphasis on education attainment. Very small proportion of police officers across the United States. Big urban areas, a lot of police officers have college degrees. Less urban areas, it's essentially unheard of. The problem is that if we are pushing for, or the natural evolution of policing is that we're moving to community policing, where officers are going to have more tools, more abilities to interact with the public and to learn how to de-escalate situations and be better at resolving situations that would otherwise be arrestable situations. There's a pretty good argument that you're going to need more education or more training to be good at that. The attempts to increase the levels of education have been around since again the beginning of the 1900s, and different organizations or different funds have been created to provide money to police officers to encourage them to get higher education. There's lots of pros that I think you can think of. Some of the cons would be is that the requirement in some of these smaller jurisdictions requiring a college degree, there just wouldn't be enough people to apply for the job, just because there aren't enough people who are college educated in small rural jurisdictions that could qualify. The other problem is that probably less so now, but it used to be that if you required a college education, poor people or people of color would be sort of self-selected out or selected out of being eligible, but to be a police officer. There's plenty of studies out there that shows more education helps, makes police officers make better decisions. It also makes them happier people. They handle their job better, and because they handle their job better, their stress is lower. There have been some court cases as to whether or not it is legal for a police agency to require college education as a criteria for hiring. And the courts have kind of uniformly held that it is legal to do so. It may not be practical to do so, but it's legal to do so. Again, empirical studies show that police officers with higher education receive fewer citizen complaints. They have better peer relationships. They're more flexible. They take fewer sick days, and they're more likely to seek leadership roles. As I indicated before, the cons are administrators fear minority recruitment would suffer. And there are some studies that suggest that that there are some negative effects of higher education, is that the people who are with higher education burn out faster or realize that their level of education would make them eligible for other kinds of work that's less stressful, so they leave. So when we're talking about the emergence of community policing, this is in here just to sort of remind you as to who the Gen Zs are, the millennials, the Gen Xs, the baby boomers, these much older folks, the traditionalists or silent generation, the greatest generation. From about the millennials up, that's a different group, and that group from about 77 on to the present, those folks have a tendency to favor community policing, newer models of community policing. And as a result of that, as baby boomers move out of the workforce, and these millennials, Gen Zs come into the workforce, people's view of policing is going to change. You're going to have more officers who are wise in social media. Strategies for hiring and retaining the new generation are going to change. There's going to be more opportunities for specialization, different ways of evaluating performance, and probably more flexible schedules. So that's it for this week. And we will suggest some additional topics that you can do a discussion board, or even you can discuss on your blogs. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.